Excellent. Well, thank you all for coming tonight and welcome. I'm going to just start by asking everybody to please mute their microphones for this beginning introduction so that we don't have any background noise. So thank you for joining the first public meeting to discuss the Upper Nemasket River Enhancement Plan. My name is Emily Vogler. I'm a landscape architect and planner. I have a small practice where I work with communities to involve them in the design and planning of their natural and civic environments. And it's been great to be working with the project team on the Upper Nemasket River Enhancement Plan. So thank you all for coming, and it's a pleasure to be here. I was actually just out at the Nemasket River last week and was able to see the herring run, which hopefully some of you all have had a chance to go out and see. It was a beautiful sight. There were tons of people out watching the herring. It's really amazing to see the annual migration, and just a big shout out to the Herring Commission for all the work that they have done and do as stewards of the river and the herring. And really we're here today to build on that work and to bring the broader community together to have a conversation about the future of the Upper Nemasket River and to think more long-term about the planning and about some of the various alternatives that could help to address some of the underlying issues in the river. Before we get started, though, I just want to also say thank you to LakeCAM for hosting. Jose and his team at LakeCAM doing an amazing job of keeping people connected right now with the pandemic. And in addition, many of you are probably familiar with Eric Anderson's wonderful documentary series about the Nemasket River. And many of you, I think I recognize from the movies. But if you haven't seen them, I highly recommend them. They're really an excellent overview of some of the current issues on the Nemasket River. So just going to jump in. So to talk about the goals and the agenda for this evening. We have a couple of goals for tonight. The first is to introduce the project. This is our first meeting, and so it's just a chance to introduce everyone to the project. We want to clarify the relationship between this project and a couple of other projects that are taking place right now in the watershed. We want to cover some basics of river hydrology that are going to help us as we all work together in the coming year to discuss the Nemasket River. And most importantly, really tonight is intended as a listening session. We want to get a better understanding of what issues are important to you all as the community and ensure that they are incorporated and reflected in the project objectives at this very initial stage before we start thinking about possible alternatives. So the plan will be to have an introductory presentation now for about 35 minutes, where we will introduce the whole project team. We'll talk about some of these different planning efforts, and we'll have a bit of that kind of overview of rivers that will help us as we begin to build our understanding of rivers and also the Nemasket River more specifically. Then we will be moving into small breakout groups, where we will have smaller group discussions where we can hear from you all about what you think are the priorities in thinking about the future of the Nemasket River. And then we'll come back together as a whole group where we will be able to talk about some of the next steps in the process and some of the upcoming opportunities for you to continue to be involved. So just to start off with some housekeeping, we are here in Zoom, which is challenging for those of us who enjoy community engagement and involving communities, but I think we're all making the best of it. But I just ask for everybody to be patient as we work through these technologies. Just a couple of overview things. Please mute yourself during these presentations, these introductory presentations. Feel free to have a pen and paper ready and to note any questions that might come up during the presentation. You're also welcome to enter any questions into the chat box, but we will be holding questions to this until we're in our small group discussions and also at the end of the presentation tonight. After the presentations, after this introduction, you're going to be automatically moved into a breakout room by our staff. You don't need to do anything, but you will have to press the join button on your screen in order to join your breakout group. Please don't click leave at any point. Otherwise, you will leave the workshop, and then you could just rejoin if you accidentally left, but press join, not leave. And then once you get into the breakout rooms, you can unmute yourself and turn on your video. And so that way you could have a small group discussion to talk more specifically about the river. We are going to be recording this workshop session. It's just a way for us to have an archive and also to make sure that all of the great comments that we hear tonight are recorded. So we're also going to be recording the breakout groups. If at any point you do lose connection, which sometimes happens with internet or accidentally leave, you can use the same link in order to re-enter the workshop. So just kind of jump back in and we'll figure out, if you're in a breakout group, we'll figure out where to place you. And then just lastly, working with online technology, there is the possibility that we could get Zoom bombed. Fingers crossed nothing happens, but if that happens, just turn off your sound. You could walk away from your computer, you could turn off your monitor, you could even leave the meeting, and we'll try to address the issue as quickly as possible. And then we could plan to all rejoin and turn back on our screens in a couple of minutes, probably 2 minutes, in order to allow for us to resolve the issue. So fingers crossed we don't run into any of those difficulties tonight. And just to reference, just most people are familiar with or too familiar with Zoom at this point, but here's the mute button in your lower left, and where you can turn on and off your video, the chat if you want to add any comments, and then end if you want to leave the meeting. So that's just a bit of overview. And then just along with that, our goal here is to create a kind of safe space where we're all being respectful, where, there might be differing viewpoints that come up during the call. That's fine. Our goal is just to be respectful of each other. During small group discussions, please let one person speak at a time, try not to interrupt. And also it's important to note that in terms of respect, we're also here in respect of kind of you all as the community, and we're not here to advocate for any one alternative or any one solution for the river. We're here to work with you all to explore how a range of alternatives can meet the various project goals for the future of the Nemasket River. And so I think that's really important in terms of kind of understanding the range of how we can interpret respect in this planning process. So with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to my colleague, Helen, from SERPED, who will talk a bit about the background of how we got to where we are today, the project team, and how this differs from some of the other planning processes that are taking place in the watershed today.
Okay, thanks, Emily.
Thank you.
So you have in front of you the project team for this Upper Nemasket enhancement work that we're currently discussing tonight. There's myself. I'm the Assistant Director of the Environmental Program at SERPED, the regional planning agency for Southeastern Massachusetts. I work very closely with our Director of our Environmental Programs, Bill Napolitano. Then we have Danica Warrens, the Climate Resilience Coordinator at Mass Audubon. We have a stellar team from the Nature Conservancy, Maria Gabriel and Sarah Burns. Equally stellar team from Horsley Witten Group, Neil Price, who you'll hear from tonight, and Ellie Baker. And of course, you've heard from Emily. And we also have Eric Wahlberg, who works with our kind of climate services consulting. So next slide, Emily. So the work that we're doing tonight is focused on the Upper Nemasket, and we are defining that to be kind of from the outlet of the APC up through the Wareham Street area. And we also have an ongoing watershed management plan process. The Watershed Management and Climate Action Plan, it's a 2-year process that's funded by a Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grant, which is a program administered by the state. And basically that project, it looks at a lot of different factors going on in the entire watershed. The watershed consists of the ponds complex, the Nemasket River, but also a lot of the surrounding upland area. So you have kind of a larger scale, and it covers a number of topics from water supply, since the ponds are, it's a large water supply area for several cities and portions of towns in Southeastern Massachusetts. Water quality, we're talking about floodwater management, land use and kind of upland issues, recreational access to the river, the ecology of the watershed, and especially important and unique habitat species like the herring. And then kind of the understanding the different actors who are all involved in caring for and stewarding the watershed. So Ellie, if you could go to the next slide. The work we're doing tonight is going to feed into that larger, it's work that we're doing in its own right. So it's really important that we drill down into the specific issues in the kind of Upper Nemasket and advance solutions for addressing those. But it also will feed into and become part of the larger watershed management plan, because the actions that we're going to kind of come up with through this process, where we want to start working on implementing those immediately, but all this will take some time, and the Watershed and Climate Action Plan is a really good umbrella for all of this work to live in together. Next slide, Emily. So this is just a kind of a locational representation of what I was just talking about, the different project scales. So on the right-hand side, you have kind of our focused Upper Nemasket study area from the ponds up kind of through Wareham Street. And we're doing this current kind of public outreach and trying to understand community needs and values around this Upper Nemasket area. While at the same time, we're also running this parallel process that looks at the entire watershed, and that is represented on the left. So those are the depictions of the Assawamsett Ponds watershed and the Nemasket River watershed. That process will also have a public engagement component, and it'll be a really great vehicle and avenue for us to discuss kind of the particulars of other geographic reaches within the watersheds, like the Long Pond area, like the Great Quiticus, Little Quiticus, Paksha Pond, western side area. So there will be lots of opportunity for more public discussion around this larger watershed management plan. And tonight we're just zoomed in, and for this process, zoomed in that more kind of limited extent, so we can really drill down into some specific solutions here. All right, I want to turn it back over to Emily.
Great, thanks, Helen. Excellent. So zooming out just a little bit, I always find it helpful, to think of these of places in multiple scales. And so looking at the Nemasket River, its relationship between the Assawamsett Pond complex along with the Taunton River, and the kind of range of land uses that we see here within the region. And I think when I first got involved in the project, I was most impressed by the amount of wetlands also that exist. And so here in this map, we see not only the ponds and the rivers, but also the surrounding wetlands, right? So really thinking about this whole landscape, right, as a very wet landscape, and beginning to understand where and how we can, how that can begin to contribute to the way that we think about the planning and imagining of the river. And then just the limited scale, or the limited scope, like Helen mentioned, that we will be focusing on in this process. And so just to kind of clarify, because I think, there are going to be two parallel processes that are taking place over the next couple of months, and there's going to be similarly two parallel public conversations happening. And so what's inside of this planning process are going to be discussions about the Assawamsett Pond Dam, the Upper Nemasket River channel and its relationship to the adjacent wetlands, some of the bridge crossings that are pinch points of the river, as well as the Wareham Street Dam, right? That all falls within the scope of what we will be discussing here in terms of the physical aspects of the Upper Nemasket River. Some of the things that are outside and that will be kind of tabled or brought into the discussions for the larger management plan are issues related to the water management permits, stormwater management throughout the watershed, as well as the operations and management of the dams, right? So obviously it's very hard because these are highly interconnected issues, and we're fully aware of that. And one of the great things is there's a lot of crossover in our project team between people who are working on the Upper Nemasket River Enhancement Plan, as well as the APC Watershed Management Plan. And so there's a lot of discussions and crossover. And the goal is that they will work together, right, in terms of both that larger kind of planning that'll take place at the watershed, as well as the more specific understanding of the physical possibilities of alternatives for the Nemasket River itself. And just to clarify some of these kind of specific points that we will be focusing on in the coming months in this planning process. With that, and then here we see these photographs of these different sites, which many of you are probably familiar with, but it's always helpful to see them to remember what it is that we're here to discuss. With that, I want to hand it over to my colleague, Neil. Neil is a hydrologist from Horsley Witten, as Helen mentioned, and he is going to be our kind of team expert when it comes to rivers and understanding the hydrology of rivers, understanding how the various alternatives are going to impact the flow and the function of the river. And so we thought, as we all are beginning to embark in this planning process together, that it's just helpful to have a kind of basic understanding of rivers and how they function. That's going to help us as we begin to imagine which alternatives might be viable and be able to discuss and weigh the pros and cons of the different alternatives moving forward. So with that, I'll hand it over to Neil to take it over and just let me know when you want me to advance the slides, Neil.
Thanks, Emily. You can advance now. So hello, everyone. Good evening. As Emily mentioned, I'm leading what's often called the hydrology and hydraulic study of the upper river, H&H for short. And what those things mean, the hydrology is how much water is available in the system. So it all originates from rain. By the way, can people see my cursor? No? Okay. So the water cycle, you've all seen, many of you have seen this diagram, something like this since grade school, showing how water moves through the environment, evaporating from the oceans, raining down, and that rain that falls really drives everything in every aquatic system. So some of that rain will run off the surface, some of it will infiltrate into the ground, some of it will be either evaporated directly from the water surface or transpired, which is a big word for what plants do when they take water from their roots, use it, and then release it back to the atmosphere from the leaves. So we sometimes refer to the combination of evaporation and transpiration as just evapotranspiration because the effect is the same for both processes. Next slide, please, Emily. And when you're looking at any given system, we often look at a mass balance. So this slide, you could most easily envision the Assawampsett Pond complex as the storage component, right? So the water that's entering it is coming either from tributaries, direct runoff, precip direct on the surface, groundwater inflow from below it, and if there are, I don't believe there are in this case, but if there were wastewater discharges or other direct people-generated discharges to the system. And then water leaves through that evapotranspiration process that I mentioned, through outflow through the river, through groundwater outflow, and through pumping withdrawals, which are definitely a large component of the water balance for the Assawampsett ponds here. Next, please. So we want to talk about how urbanization affects hydrology, and it affects it in a really dramatic way. Because we'll be talking a lot about how changes in the river affects how the river functions and how we might want to address those. So as we talked about, we have hydrology, which is how much water goes into the system, and hydraulics, which is after that water is in the system, how does it move? How high does it get? How fast does it flow? Where does it go to? So the hydrology is sort of like the energy that goes into the system, and the hydraulics are how that energy is dissipated as it moves from higher elevation to lower elevation. So with urbanization, the slide on the left, the picture on the top left, shows a natural system where you would, in general, have something like 50% of the rainfall infiltrate into the ground. And the other half will be either evapotranspired, about 40%, with only about 10% of it being lost to runoff. And this is important because of the timing of the situation. So with that infiltration, the water will move relatively slowly through groundwater before it can reach any streams or rivers and then continue to flow outwards. On the right, after some urbanization occurs, you've really changed that balance. So instead of 10% runoff, you now have 55% runoff. So all that rain falling on roofs and roads and walkways and parking lots generally just goes into catch basins, moves through pipes, and ultimately gets discharged straight to rivers and streams where it quickly exits the system. So a lot of that rain is therefore lost from groundwater. So it's not available as long-term base flow for the rivers. By base flow, I mean the flow that's available in the river for the weeks-long period in between major rain events that sometimes happen in like August or September or something like that. And the other side effect is that fast runoff makes for flood situations. You put more water into the stream channel in a small period of time than it has been evolved to handle in the natural situation. And that's the picture on the bottom shows this. This is what's called a hydrograph, right? So it's flow on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. So purple, the blue or purple color is a natural hydrograph, which kind of shows how it starts to rain at a certain time and the flow goes up, and then it slowly dissipates and goes away as time progresses. The green is a more urbanized situation where you get a much more rapid increase in flow to a much higher level that also decreases much faster. And then after the storm has passed, there's much less flow available in the river. So therein is the fundamental problem with the hydrology issue with urbanization. Next slide, please. So the hydraulics, right? So this is after you've got the water in the system, how does it move? And essentially, this is really what we talk about is flow in cubic feet per second is commonly the units that are used around here. You could use gallons per minute or gallons per day or anything like any volume per unit time, but CFS is a common one. And that's essentially equal to the cross-sectional area through which the channel, so the wet area of the channel that the water can flow, times the velocity in feet per second. So that gets you square feet per second, actually cubic feet per second in flow. So if you take in this example, we've got a imaginary 100 CFS hydrology input to the system, just to keep our numbers even. And in the top, we have a more natural system where the stream channel is connected to the floodplain. So the area that 100 CFS can flow into is 1,000 square feet, again, just for the entire blue area that you see in that picture. So again, just for round numbers. So using the equation on the top, if you divide that out, the velocity equals the flow divided by the area, and you get a flow velocity of 0.1 feet per second. So the water is moving pretty slowly through the system in this situation. If you alter it in the lower diagram, say by dredging a straight channel and building levees the way that we've done through much of our major rivers in the Midwest and elsewhere, now you've disconnected the river from the floodplain. That means the cross-sectional area through which that water can flow is much smaller. In this case, we're using 10 square feet to keep our math simple. So you throw that same 100 CFS through only a 10 square foot area, you do that same division, and now your velocity is 10 feet per second, 100 times higher than it was in the natural condition. So those velocities are erosive, and they can do damage. They can erode sediment and banks and cause damage to buildings and roads and other infrastructure that is near the river channel. So this is the problem with hydraulics. So we've got our hydrology problem of how much water, the timing of water entering the system, and our hydraulic problem of how it moves through the system. And when you have altered both in the same direction, you can get really dramatic and bad results. Next, please. So the other thing with the rivers is sediment, right? So they're moving not only water, but they're moving sediment. And the amount of sediment that a river can move depends on how fast it's flowing, because fast water can carry more and larger sediment size particles than can slow water. And this is, you see this all the time in the natural world, where at the beach or wherever where you get different accumulations. So again, remember, fast water carries more and larger particles. Slow water lets those particles drop out and deposit. So next, please. So this whole balance of stream flow and sediment load was put into this great picture by a man named Lane in the 1950s, at the time when the whole science of rivers was being developed. So this is essentially like the scales of justice, where the arrow in the middle will move left or right depending on how the balance shifts. And so if the left side that's labeled sediment load goes down, the arrow will move to the right where it's labeled aggradation in the middle. Aggradation means deposition. So if you have more sediment weighting that balance in that direction, you will deposit sediment. And vice versa. The other way, if you have more flow, then you will slide it over to degradation or erosion. But you also notice on the left to right ruler, those two flow and sediment load things can slide left to right themselves. So depending on how the sediment size and or the power of the stream changes, you can also change whether you are in an erosive or degrading environment. And I will, next slide, we'll go into details on that. Okay, so in this situation, we've got more flow, more power to the stream. Our hydrology is such that we've put more water into the system, whether it be through paving or whatever. And that has caused the balance to tilt so that we're now in an erosive situation, and a picture on the bottom left showing a stream that's eroding as a result of that. Next slide, please. And the other way around, let's say you are getting more sediment into the system without changing the flow power at all. Now that sediment will tend to drop out and fill into the channel, which is shown in that picture below. And the next slide, please. And what you hopefully want is what's called dynamic equilibrium. And this is what every river will eventually, left to its own due process, will get to. It will respond to the environmental conditions, the hydrology that's being given to it, and the hydraulics around it, and get itself to equilibrium. Whether we who live near it wanted to or not, that's what the river's going to do. It will erode and erode and erode until it comes into balance, or it will deposit and deposit and deposit until it comes into balance. And if you change those conditions, it will in time respond. And by time, I could mean decades or centuries, but it will respond to those and come to new dynamic equilibrium eventually. Next slide, please. So this is showing, again, a cross-section through a river with in the center, you see what we normally think of as the river channel. And the dark blue is a low flow period, maybe in September, where the water is. The lighter blue is labeled as bank full stage. So that's like a full river channel, what most people think of being just the river. And those flow conditions normally happen on about every 1 to 2 year frequency. So a storm event that might come around about once every year to 2 years is the primary river forming flow event that creates what the channel looks like, where its banks are, and so forth. Higher storms then spill over the top of those banks into what's labeled as the active floodplain. Now you see on the far left something called abandoned floodplain. So this is that evolution I was talking about, with the river trying to come to dynamic equilibrium. At some point in the past, this river would have been a little higher up and connected to that abandoned floodplain. Over time, it eroded downward, and then trying to seek its balance, it spilled over the banks enough to create that new floodplain and the new situation, and now is again in equilibrium. Next, please. So just a couple of pictures to illustrate this. So on the left is a natural, properly functioning stream flowing at bank full depth. So you can see the water is right up at the top of the banks. If it goes any higher, it'll spill right over that big wide wetland floodplain. When it does that, the velocities will drop dramatically and it won't do any damage. Sediment that's being carried in that river channel will get deposited in those wetlands, helping their health and well-being. The system's working properly. On the right is a stream that you can see has eroded downward and is now separated, isolated from its floodplain. So the river can no longer flood over the top onto the floodplain. So that means even when the big storm events, a 100-year storm comes along and puts lots and lots of flow, it's stuck in that channel and it's going to erode downward and cause damage rather than spill over the tops. Next, please. So rivers also want to meander, and the sinuosity or the meander shape depends on all of these things we were just talking about, this balance of stream power, slope, and sediment transport. But what's important as you look on the bottom here is, if you think about this, a bit of water traveling from point A to point B, if it were to go straight, it would have a slope shown in the bottom as straight channel slope, pretty steep. Because it's going a short distance, it's covering the same vertical drop regardless, but it's going a shorter distance. The meandering pathway creates that shallower slope because it's going a much longer distance to cover that same vertical drop. So that means that the erosive power of the stream is less in the meandering situation. Next, please. So this is a favorite of mine. So here's a picture of a straightened channelized stream in a newspaper advertisement from the 1930s, advocating for the use of dynamite to deal with these pesky meandering streams that are a menace to life and crops in the area. So 1930s was before Mr. Lane came up with his balance and we really understood how rivers worked. So a lot of damage was done by doing stuff just like this in the attempts to, in the good intended intents to make the situation better. We now know that that's a losing battle to fight here. Next, please. And here's just a slide illustrating that losing battle when you try to put infrastructure in the floodplain very close to the river channel, put more water in that river channel than it was designed to handle. The river will fight back and try to get itself into equilibrium. And this hefty Jaws-sized chunk of road taken out is an example of such. Next, please. And so that's that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Neil. So, we're lucky to have Neil on our project team as a hydrologist, and we'll be working on the H&H model, the hydrology and hydraulics model. And Neil will be talking a little bit about the H&H model that'll be coming up next. But essentially, we're taking everything that we're learning that he knows from rivers and moving forward to understand how that could help us to better understand some of the possible alternatives for the Upper Nemasket River. And how those different alternatives will begin to impact the flow and flooding within the river and the surrounding community. So turning now to talking more specifically about the Upper Nemasket River Enhancement Plan, we have coming out of the conversations that we've been having with the project team as well as the steering committee, we've come up with a set of guiding principles. These aren't yet specific goals of the project, but they're more the overarching framework within which we want to be engaging in conversations about the river. And a lot of it ties into what Neil was just talking about the nature of rivers and how they function, and understanding how do we work with that rather than against some of those existing and kind of the natural ways that rivers want to function. So some of these guiding principles include taking a holistic approach to the river, working with the river morphology to reduce the need for ongoing maintenance, where possible, working towards multifunctional solutions. And by that, I mean, alternatives that can address both fish passage as well as recreation, as well as flooding. Anticipate a future climate with more severe flooding and more severe droughts, which is, just important for us to be thinking about as we engage in this planning process because we're looking to the future. And lastly, just expanding the way we think about the river, understanding the whole watershed as a gradient of moisture where water can be held and stored in wetlands and infiltrated to help reduce flooding and recharge the river during low flow conditions. So this both gets at that map that I showed of all the wetlands that we have within the watershed, but also what Neil was saying about the hydrology of our rivers, and that while we in this planning process are focusing specifically on the Upper Nemasket River, it is going to require that we also had conversations and engage in thinking about the surrounding wetlands and where and how we can begin to imagine that relationship between the river and its surrounding floodplain. So we've been very fortunate, like I mentioned, we have an amazing steering committee that's part of the project team. And many of you probably recognize some of the leaders within the community who have been actively participating and kind of leading the discussion surrounding the APC and the Nemasket River. We've had, I think, around 3 meetings so far and some great conversations about to help the project team get up to speed and to really begin to understand some of the various trade-offs and some of the various issues that exist along the river. And so, thank you to the steering committee and to everyone who's here on the call as well today. I always think of our project team as existing in multiple scales. We have the staff, we have the steering committee, and then we have you all as the public, and all of us together are working to envision the future of the river as a bigger project team. And so some of the things that we've heard from our steering committee, we've received some great feedback up until now about issues that they think are important for us to address in the Nemasket River. Some of these include concerns about low flow and high flow conditions in the river, concerns about sediment in the river, and the fact that the sediment is settling in the channel, which leads to reduced channel depth. And this reduced channel depth is leading to a growth of aquatic plants. The reduced channel depth and the aquatic plants together are leading to reduced fish passage, as well as reduced recreational opportunities. And this reduced channel depth also leads to an increase in flooding. which and also to concerns that there are between in the water supply and the within the river, as well as in the pond complex, and also concerns over the habitat for aquatic and riparian species. And so, like I said, we've received some great feedback from the steering committee that's really helped us as we've started to understand and develop an initial idea of some of the project goals of, what are the issues that we're trying to address through this planning process. But we're here today, like I mentioned earlier, really to hear from you all, to hear from the broader public about what do you think are important issues to be addressed as we begin these conversations about the future of the Upper Nemasket River. So we're going to be dividing up into a series of smaller conversations through the breakout groups. And in these conversations, we have a couple of questions that we are going to use in order to help facilitate a conversation about the river. Some of the questions that we will be talking through include, when you imagine a healthy, resilient Nemasket River, what does that look like to you? You could describe this both in terms of what it might actually physically look like or how it might function. You can describe a physical condition of what you might see or use kind of descriptive words in order to help explain this. What are some of the key issues that you want to make sure are addressed in this planning process? I had mentioned a couple that came up during our steering committee meetings. What are some of the key issues or concerns that you have about the Nemasket River? What do we want to make sure to protect in this process, right? As we begin to envision the future and imagine changes, there's also really important that we take time to pause and say, well, what do we have now? And what do we want to make sure isn't lost as we go forward? And then trying to narrow in for this question, we're asking for the participants in the group to identify their 5 most important project objectives. And this will help as we start to rank or start to think about how to prioritize some of the different issues and understand how they should begin to factor into our evaluation of the various alternatives. And then the last question is, how can the community be good stewards of the river? Like I mentioned earlier, we're all very fortunate here in the Nemasket to have the Herring Commission, which has done an amazing job of working in this river and being stewards of the river and the herring. But how can we think about the broader community and how to engage in and reconnect people to this river as part of the identity and really the unique identity of living in this area? And so thinking about these various opportunities that might exist to engage the broader, everybody in these future conversations. So we are going to move into our breakout groups. Fingers crossed, there's no technological difficulties. It's always challenging in Zoom, and in normal rooms, we would just break out into groups, but I think we'll work through this. So here are the questions. Like I said, they're going to also be with your, there'll be a facilitator in each group and from our project team who will help guide the conversation. And really what we're asking you to do is to think about, okay, we are here today, March 30th, 2021. And if we imagine this, kind of 20, 30, 40 years down the road, where do we want to get to? What are our hopes? And that's really the goal of the conversation today. These questions are really just intended to help guide the conversation. If you don't get to all of them, that's totally fine. But really our hope is just to be able to have this conversation and to hear from you all about what you imagine that future to be, what do you hope that future is for the river. In the breakout groups, the facilitators will be using Jamboards to take notes. So don't be surprised when you go into your room that there will be some note taking. And with that, I'm going to ask Danica to divide us into our breakout groups. Let's plan to reconvene here at 8:15, Danica. So that gives us a half an hour for the discussions. When Danica presses breakout groups, it's going to pop up with a screen like this on your Zoom screen. And you should be able to press join in order to join your group. And you'll kind of automatically, it's this kind of magic that happens in Zoom where everybody gets reorganized. I will be staying here in the main group. And so for anybody who is joining by phone or who's watching on cable or on Facebook, you can feel free to call in. And I will be here in the main room and can help with any of that discussion in this main room, but everybody else will go into separate breakout groups. So with that, Danica, I think if you could divide us into our breakout groups, that'd be great. And I look forward to seeing everybody back here in a half an hour. Okay. Excellent. That seemed to work, Danica. Yeah, excellent. Great. So I think this is going to be our group here. If we could just start by turning on everybody's camera, that would be great. So we can do a round of introductions in our smaller group here. If you are unable to, that is fine as well. Excellent. Okay, excellent. So we're going to start off with a round of introductions. I'm happy to have us all here in this smaller group. So you've heard from us now for the past half an hour, but really our goal for the next half an hour is to hear from you all about your thoughts and vision for the future of the Nemasket River. So if we could just start with a quick round of introductions, if everybody could please introduce themselves, say your name, as well as your relationship with the river. That would be a great way to get started as we then move into discussing some of those specific questions. So I will call on people so that it makes it easier to move through the group. Let's see, I'm going to go ahead and just go through on my list. Maybe Danica, you could just quickly introduce yourself since you're here in the room with us and you'll help.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Danica Warrens. I'm a climate resilience coordinator at Mass Audubon, and I'm working with Emily to help facilitate this process.
Great. Thank you. Excellent. I have Janet Mack. Is that correct?
Yeah. Hi. I volunteer on the Herring Commission. I have a cold, so I'm not feeling real energized.
Okay. Well, you can feel free to participate or just listen in however you wish. See, Nancy.
Hi, I'm Nancy Yates, Environmental Manager of the Assawamsett Pond Complex.
Thank you for joining us, Nancy. Christopher Rico.
Yep. Hi, my name is Chris Rico, and I've just been in the past week. I've just been volunteering for the herring count, and so I got an email today for this, and thought it sounded interesting. So excellent.
Well, good. Well, thank you for joining. Yep. Excellent. Trish Cassidy, Patricia.
Hi. I am the conservation agent for the Middleborough Conservation Commission. And I'm obviously been part of the group, kind of this, I guess, the steering committee. Yep. And I also participate in the Taunton River Watershed Stewardship Council.
Excellent. Thank you, Trish. Is it Jen? Freitas, and you guys can correct me if I'm saying your names wrong, please.
Hi there. I'm Jen Freitas Carter. I grew up on the river. My family owns quite a bit of land along the upper part of the river. So that's kind of my huge interest in it. We spent most of our summers canoeing up to the dam, and certainly seems to have changed quite a bit since I was a kid. So.
Excellent, Jen. Well, thanks for joining us. That's great. Is it JP Davis? Is your audio working? No, how about Joseph Osborne? Are you there?
How's it going?
Hi there.
I'm a Middleborough resident. I've also been kind of invited to some of the early stages planning. As a student, I'm a student at Bridgewater State. And I remembered that there was a meeting tonight, so I kind of joined on and to see how far we go. So.
Great. Excellent. Well, welcome and thank you for joining. Great. So we have a nice range of people here in our small breakout group. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen so that we can follow along with, and I could take some notes. Let's see. There we go. Excellent. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be using this, what's called a Jamboard, just to take notes. You know, it's our closest way to kind of be similar to what we do in an actual physical meeting, which I think a lot of us are missing when we can kind of take notes and have these type of interactive conversations. So like I mentioned, the first question we have here is, when you imagine a healthy, resilient Nemasket River, what does that look like to you? And like I mentioned, you know, you guys, we could go through and you all can describe what that might look like, both visually in terms of what that would appear to be. You could think about how the river would function, but just trying to get a range of ideas of, when we talk about a vision for the future of the river, what that might actually be. So without thinking of what the problems are first, maybe first starting with what is our hopes? What is our vision for what this future might look like? So I'll go ahead and go through and just ask for people to jump in and participate. Like I said, if you're not feeling up to it, you could feel free to excuse yourself and you don't have to participate. But I'll go ahead and start with, let's see, I'm just going to go down my row here. Nancy, do you want to go and jump in?
Sure. I would like to see a healthy flow in the river. Right now, because of all the aquatic invasives, there's really not a good flow in the river. If we have a rain event and too much water comes over the dam, which is another problem, but for now, too much water comes over the dam, it doesn't flow down the river. It spreads out because of all the invasives. So we don't really, and I think that over the years, the channels changed too. So at some places there are splits and water goes two ways. I'd just like to see a nice, healthy, flowing river.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Great. Let's see, does this note capture that? Healthy flow. So it's about the healthy flow, which makes sense. It seems like, I think, Nancy, we actually visited the site together last summer, and I think it was a great example of the low flow conditions. It was a trickle. And so, yes, excellent. Okay, how about, let's see. Oops, I am having, let's see, I can't seem to see your names now that I'm in the side view. So if anybody wants to just jump in, and we could kind of do it this way rather than me calling people out, because I can't seem to see people's names. Anybody else want to jump in?
I'll jump in. Biological diversity. So, you know, not having, and this would be for plants and animals.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel like there's a lack of that right now in the river, Tricia?
Well, I think that there are certain plants, as Nancy alluded to, taking over, you know, which then causes issues with other things in the ecosystem. And, you know, certain animal species, you know, could be out of balance, you know, so just in general. Yeah.
Excellent. It seems important to have redundancy in ecosystems in terms of building resilient ecosystems. So it makes sense that finding ways to enhance and build that diversity, especially in systems where there are dominant invasive species, you know, makes sense from an ecological resilience standpoint. Excellent. How about Jen? Is that right? Did I remember names? Let's see if I can remember names.
So I agree on the healthy flow of the river, and also the water levels are, you know, to me, they're terribly concerning. At the Vaughn Street Bridge this summer, you couldn't canoe under the bridge. The water was so low, my kids could hop on rocks to cross the river under the bridge. And I never remember as a kid the levels being that low. It was always low up by the dam. There was that, you know, that sandy area, but it seems to have pervasively gotten worse. So the water level is definitely a concern that I see because we get in the canoe pretty frequently, and you can't canoe in the summer months. You just can't anymore.
So concerns over the river and the impact on recreation.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Excellent. Let's see. Joseph, do you want to jump in?
I mean, I'm probably going to mimic what everybody else has said, a little bit of everything. While having a lot of the vegetation is great when you have a 4-year-old and you kayak and there's frogs everywhere. I mean, it's not right. There's so many, the invasive vegetation is by the end of the summer, you can't canoe, but you also can't even kayak, which, kayak draws significantly less water. It was a struggle by the end of the summer. So basically mimicking what everybody else is saying. Yeah.
Concerns over the low flow. Excellent. Okay. And I apologize, but I'm forgetting your name right now, the gentleman who's got this video on.
I think that's Chris.
Chris, excellent. Chris, do you want to jump in? Thank you.
Sorry. I'm not really sure what else I can add. Those are all, concerns that I agree with.
How about it? I'm just curious if anybody in this group was there during the floods. Yeah, were you there? Yeah, Jen and Trish. Because it seems like, one of the issues that we have here is the kind of, just the flow, and I think it was really helpful to hear Neil talk about it, right? In terms of the urbanization and the impacts on the watersheds when you get this kind of peak flow conditions during floods, but then also these really low flow conditions, right? And so it seems like, there's a way that, that the kind of that balance, finding that balance is going to be one of those important visions of what a healthy, resilient river is like, right? Is being able to, possibly limit the kind of high flow conditions as well as increase the low flow conditions, right? Which is really, I think, one of the overarching goals of what that future is that we're trying to work towards.
It's not only the aquatic invasives with the flow, but also the silt and sand that has gone down the river that we need to restore our wetlands, because a healthy wetland area is going to help with flood storage. And we don't really have the places of flood storage that we've had in the past because it's all full of silt and sand, and so it's not just the aquatic invasives. It's also all the siltation that's happened. And if we were to restore and have healthy wetlands that act like a sponge, when we do have flooding, there will be places for the water to go rather than flooding out homeowners.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So I think in kind of summarizing that, it seems like the core is to think about a healthy river channel, right? That it has a good, kind of more consistent flow level, and then that is good for kayaking and recreation, obviously also for the migratory fish and the juvenile fries as they're trying to migrate out, as well as the adjacent floodplain, right? And the kind of wetlands and understanding the role that they can play in that kind of channel floodplain relationship, right? And so if I was to kind of imagine it, it's, I think what's amazing about the Nemasket is that's not too far out there, right? I think as we look at the photo on this previous slide, obviously we see a lot of sediment and we see a lot of invasive plants, but there's also, unlike many other rivers that are highly urbanized, there's a lot that the river has, that it feels like that feels like a manageable goal, right? In terms of getting to that point where there's the kind of healthy flow in the river channel and the kind of floodplain that is activated in order to help store the water. Excellent. So it seems like some of the key issues that we discussed were kind of brought up in that earlier conversation, in thinking about the flow levels and thinking about the invasives. Anything else that anybody wants to add in relation to the kind of key issues or problems or concerns?
I'll add something. Water quality.
Great.
So, is there a balance enough, as far as the chemical composition, the pH of the water, all of the things having to do with water quality to sustain life.
Yep. Absolutely. Great. Anything else?
I'm not advocating it one way or another because the water's dammed up, but we have 2 dams for the fish have to contend with.
Yep. So understanding the impact of the dams on fish passage, is that what you mean?
Yes.
Great. Absolutely. I think, especially given the importance of the herring run, right, on the Nemasket River, that building that understanding of the impact of those dams is important. And that's part of what we're hoping to do, right, with both the studies as well as with looking at various alternatives for those dams. Any other comments or things that folks want to add to this slide? Okay, excellent. And then just kind of building on that, is there anything as we think about this future, right, and we plan for and imagine a future condition for the Nemasket, is there anything that, we want to make sure that we protect or that isn't lost through this process?
We have all kinds of turtles and frogs at risk. And toads.
I'll add the herring, obviously.
Absolutely. Great. Yeah, the last thing we want is to have any negative impact, right, on the herring or on the other species in the river. I mean, there's always a balance, and changes always affect things, but we want to ensure that in this process for sure. Anything else?
Maybe the open. Oh, sorry, Trish.
I think I was reading your mind because I was going to say land protection along the river. You were going to say open space, weren't you?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Oh, great minds think alike.
Land protection along the river, is that with the open space? Yeah. Absolutely.
Keeping stream buffers, basically. Yeah.
Excellent. Anything else? Anybody wants to add?
I mean, it's kind of obvious, but obviously the recreation aspect of the river, making sure that it's easily accessible.
Yeah.
It's being a Middleborough citizen and father. I mean, I spent all of last summer on the river, especially because of COVID. So that's important.
And do you feel like right now, Joseph, that that the river is accessible for recreation, or that it, you know, is, what are you feeling about it's where it is right now?
I mean, there are plenty of, you know, areas that you can access and put kayaks in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it would be nice if there was a little bit of pavement, especially, I forget what the street's called, but where Ocean Spray is.
Mm-hmm.
Any kind of heavy rain event will wash out that parking area pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I remember after one rainstorm, like there was probably a 2-foot gap that, you know, it eliminated a parking spot for anybody who wanted to put a boat in there. So,
Mm-hmm.
You know, nothing major. I mean, it's there. It just potentially could be managed a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Or not managed, but either put pavement in or some kind of parking.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be better.
Yep.
You won't protect it if you don't love it. You can't use it.
Absolutely, Janet. I think that's the key, right? Is getting people out on the river and connecting people to it is exactly what's needed to help, you know, build the love, right? Thanks, Trish. Absolutely. And I think, you know, I think it's interesting, Joseph, it seems like there's, in terms of the question of access, right, it's a bit of a trick question because there's the issue of access in terms of access points. And then there's also the issue of whether you can actually paddle on it, similar to what Jen was mentioning of, you know, the fact that it was impassable in some places. So I think, you know, part of that is, you know, is a question of physical access points as well as what's happening in the river channel.
And climate change.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think keeping that in mind in terms of those high flow and low flow conditions, right, is going to be really, really important as we think about this planning process. Because if we're already seeing that kind of really extreme highs and lows, right, we could anticipate that we will see that more and more in the future. Excellent. So I think I'm going to move on to the next question. And this one is, you know, kind of building on what we've been talking about. I would love to go around and just be able to list out those top 5 for each of you, just to help you all think about, you know, what are the top 5 objectives or goals that, you know, up for this project. So if that's about, you know, there might be redundancy amongst the group. It might be that we come up with one list, but I think we could start off with kind of each of you listing out those top 5. And we're going to start with kind of one being the most important issue that you want to make sure is addressed, even though I understand these are all interconnected, and then going down to kind of the lower list on the 5. And so we can go ahead and start that process. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this is because I feel like it both helps us understand how to prioritize these various issues as we start to look at the various alternatives. But it also helps us think about a wider range of issues because we know some of these kind of big ones that are going to probably show up in everybody's lists, you know, about flow and about the herring, you know, but I'm curious in some of the other ones that might be down on the 4s and the 5s, you know, that could just help us and help inform some of the other things that we might be considering as we consider the impacts of the various alternatives. So I'm just going to list out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we can go down the list. So maybe we'll start. Chris, do you want to jump in and start off with 1 through 5? Oh, I think you might be muted.
So I guess number 1 would be keeping the flow and the integrity of the river, or building it up, or, you know, and maintaining that. I think the second would have to do with the herring.
Great.
And then recreation.
Great.
And I guess 4 would be the involving the plants, getting rid, not having the invasive species, being such a problem.
Great.
And I'm not sure if I can think of a
5. Yeah, this seems like the top couple ones that we've been hearing in the earlier sessions as well. Maybe we'll just make a collective list so we don't go through the same ones. Is there anything that isn't on this list? I guess I should ask. Any of those things that are at the bottom?
Climate has to be way up there.
Yep, great.
Like
So
planning for extremes.
absolutely. Planning for extremes. Great.
Which obviously you can use many things to assist with that.
Absolutely.
I would say retrofitting the dam and installing a silt trap is way up there for me.
The dam.
I know there's talk about replacing it, but I think because the cost of that retrofitting might be a cheaper, easier solution.
Yep.
Quicker than trying to get the money to replace the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So retrofitting dam. I'm assuming
Which dam?
APC,
Excuse
right?
me, which dam?
At the head of the Nemasket.
The APC, that's Upson Pond Dam. Yeah. Great.
Not removing it, but redesigning that area downstream.
And retrofitting it, it's like almost a danger now to lift that you manually. It's 100 years old or plus, and you have to lift the wooden boards that are waterlogged in and out of it. It's a dangerous thing for the people that have to do it.
Absolutely. So retrofitting the APC dam, I'm going to separate those out a little bit, Nancy, and just have that separate from addressing the sediment, right?
Okay.
So, because I feel like they can either go together or be separate.
Well, that's why I didn't know, because they're talking about installing a silt trap, and that might be part of it. I don't know how that would happen.
Absolutely. We'll be looking into that. Great. Anything else that's not on our list?
I would say removing the Bascule Dam at Wareham Street.
Did you say removing?
Yes.
Just making sure I got that right. Okay. Yep.
And I mean, that kind of goes into a couple other projects, like, the sediment above that dam.
Yep.
And also the old DPW site, soon to be becoming a open space and access for recreation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great opportunity. Excellent. Jen, is there anything that you wanted to add to this list that isn't there right now? Or
I can't say that I have anything to add, no.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you.
Joseph, did you have anything else?
I don't really have anything to add, but I do think invasive, addressing something invasive from should probably be higher up in the list. Because if you address some of the, especially the vegetation, it resolves, or at least, helps with a lot of the flow and pretty much everything else on the list. It'll benefit. So
great. Excellent. Well, we have a couple more minutes here, and before we jump off and we rejoin, I think we're going to be rejoining the rest of the group in just a couple minutes. Just one, quick conversation about how the community can be good stewards of the river. I really appreciated what you said. I think it was I forget who was it said it, but that in order to love the river, it's about getting out there, right, and being on the river. And I think that's a really important point of how we kind of restitch the river back into the community and back into the lives of the people who live around it to build the respect and the stewardship. Just any other ideas of opportunities that might exist for how to encourage the stewardship and kind of ownership and love of the Nemasket River?
Education.
Great.
Fishing is always, people who fish always support nature.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's always my favorite is when there's those crossovers between the different communities. And I think fishing is one of those things that connects people around the rivers. Great.
I have one more comment to make about the flow of the river and the weeds. They're interrelated. If the river flows more readily and more freely, then the weeds do not take root. So it's kind of a vicious cycle going on now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're trying to do in this process, is not just kind of do a short-term solution that addresses one of them, but to understand how they begin to work together, right? And think about that holistic. So I think you're entirely right on the interconnectedness of all these issues, right? The sediment, which causes then the invasives to be able to grow on it, which then causes the low flow. So absolutely. Any other final thoughts on stewardship and how to build, help to strengthen the relationship of the community to the river?
I say organize events.
Yep.
Which we have in the past. We've had the Herring Festival. Obviously, COVID prevented that last year. But yeah, like kayak and canoe events. I mean, we have a canoe race with the park department. Just, yeah, getting the public involved and taking ownership of it and feeling they're part of it.
Great. Absolutely. Jen, did you have something to add?
Yeah, so that was going to be one of them, events surrounding the river. I'm always amazed at how many people really don't know that Assawampset Pond is the source of our river. But also, I think some of it has to start in our school systems, truthfully. So I have 3 kids, as you can see, that have been popping in and out all night. So my son was, last year during remote learning, the schools were assigning different topics, and he had to learn about the waterways in Massachusetts. And they had the Nemasket River. I'm assuming they learned about it because it was in town. Yet they did not mention anything about Assawampset Pond Complex at all. Whereas there were other, waterways that were mentioned. So I kind of thought that was a real problem, that kids that are in our own community aren't learning anything about our own waterway. So I don't know how we can involve that, but I do think that's important. And I feel like field trips, to places along, surrounding the ponds, those are things that are complete missed opportunities in the public school system. Absolutely. That's such a great comment. And I totally agree. I couldn't agree more, right? I think that's just absolutely important that, especially there's just such a great opportunity for both the students in terms of the education, but also for the reconnecting with the river. And so that's a great comment. And many of the schools are, at least in Middleborough, within walking distance of the herring run. Yet they don't learn anything about the herring. So unless you have a parent that's helping you to learn about this, there's nothing.
Absolutely. And it's such a great opportunity for STEM or STEAM education as well, to think about how to, get students out and get kids out. So
Right.
Great. Any other final comments on stewardship and how to build stewards? I have to say, I loved when I was out at the Oliver Mill and Wareham Street last week. It was amazing to me, the number of people who just came out to see the herring run. And I just thought it was a beautiful sight. I'd never really seen that. And so it feels like, just how do you build that up? How do you strengthen that? And how do you really use it as, an opportunity to say, this place is unique, right? This is something that's very unique to Lakeville and Middleborough. And how do we celebrate that as part of both our history and also our kind of present culture? And so it seems, like there's a good start there. It's like, how do we now kind of boost that, right? And I think all those are great suggestions.
Yeah, the town is actually Middleborough anyway, is looking into, branding the town and doing some public art projects that, highlight the herring. And
Great. Excellent. I didn't realize that I think we've been joined by the rest of the group.
I was just going to try to warn you. Sorry, with sharing the screen, I don't know if you can see the chat.
I couldn't see that.
Yes, so everyone has been brought back into our room now.
Okay. Oops. Excellent. Great. Well, we were in the main room, so I didn't see that. So hopefully everybody had some good conversations during the breakout groups. It was a great opportunity to just hear more directly from everyone about, about your experience, your lives living close to the river, and your visions. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen one last time to wrap up here. Let's see if my computer is going to behave. Yes. Okay. Excellent. So just to wrap up, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes now talking about where we're headed next. As I mentioned earlier, today was really just intended as an introduction to the project. We're going to be working on this for the next couple of months. Great to hear from you all. And there'll be multiple opportunities for you to connect and hopefully stay involved in the project moving forward. Some of the next specific steps of what we'll be working on, coming out of today's conversations and our previous conversations with the steering committee, we're going to be developing a list of project objectives, essentially just trying to capture everything we've heard about what our hopes are for the future of the Nemasket River. And I think we've heard a lot, and it feels like we're at the point where we could develop an initial list that helps to clarify, what these project objectives are. We're then going to move into discussing and exploring various alternatives. So looking at what are the possible options that exist to meet these goals. And when we think about these alternatives, we'll be looking at them for both the Asawamsett Pond Dam, the channel, as well as the Bascule Dam, right? And so there's going to be multiple aspects of alternatives that we'll be exploring moving forward. Once we get that list of alternatives, we will then start running the hydrologic and hydraulic model on the alternatives. That will help us to be able to estimate how the different alternatives can meet our project objectives, right? So essentially it's saying, here's our goals of what we want to accomplish in this process. Here are some of the alternatives. How well do these various alternatives help us to meet our goals, right? And that's really the process that we'll be going through. That could allow for us to evaluate the alternatives. And then in the end, we'll be reporting out on the process. And then in terms of other moments that'll allow for you all to participate in these conversations, we will be having a public meeting, a second public meeting in June, where we will present our final list of project objectives, like I mentioned, that have grown out of today's conversations. At this meeting, we will also be discussing alternatives, and that will all take place that'll all take place during the second meeting. So it's going to be a big one. So hopefully you all will be able to attend in order to participate in this discussion, make sure we caught everything that you all mentioned today. We will then go away as a kind of staff project team, run the H&H model, do some estimates, and then we'll come back for our third public meeting, which will allow for you all to participate in evaluating and ranking these various alternatives. And then we'll finally report out on the process. In terms of a summary of this approach, essentially what we're working on is that we have a decision, right? We're all trying to work towards a decision about how do we help improve the health of the Nemasket River, right? And our hope through this process is that we could identify some of these key trade-offs, identify some of the key alternatives, and lay out a consistent and transparent process that can help us make decisions and also then go after the funding and that will be needed in order to make these happen, right? And so really this is this kind of planning process, but our goal is on the ground action, and that this helps to connect and helps to prioritize and helps to build the support that's needed to do the on the ground action. Finally, that this process, really our goal is that it's going to include scientific facts. We're going to, we're super excited to have Neil run the H&H model, but we also want to make sure that it's capturing the community values of what's important to you all, and what do we want to make sure that this project achieves in terms of reconnecting the community and the river. And in terms of our timeline, we have these kind of multiple timelines, and this is a little bit complicated, but we are here right now in our public workshops. We have gone through a kind of an initial process of framing the project. We've begun to identify some of our objectives or what our goals are. We've begun to really, just begin to think about possible alternatives. The next step is to finalize or to begin to formulate these alternative packages and to finalize the model of existing conditions. We will then come back for the public workshop that I mentioned in June, where we can discuss the alternative packages, make sure we're not missing anything, make sure everybody's comfortable moving forward with these. That'll then allow for us to move into the evaluation period, where we'll then come back for the third public meeting, our public workshop, to evaluate those alternatives. And then the last part will be the sharing of the results. And so that's really the bigger trajectory of where we're heading. Like you could see on the top, our goal is that this process will be wrapping up in the fall. As always, there might be a little bit of flexibility, but our hope is that we could come back together for these meetings during the summer, and then by the end of this fall, be able to deliver a report that captures some of these key issues, alternatives, and evaluates these various alternatives to be able to understand which one is most effective in reaching our project goals. With that, I'm going to quickly hand it over to Neil, who will discuss the specifics of the hydrologic and hydraulic model and how that's going to actually inform our decision-making in these next phases.
Thanks, Emily. So once you're in the know, like everyone on this Zoom meeting now is, you can just call it an H&H model, so you don't have to stumble over the big words in the title. So the model itself is being used, is using a software program called HECRAS, which is just an acronym developed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's been used for decades for this kind of thing. And it uses input hydrology again, so that's the amount of water that's being delivered to the river under different storm events. So for example, the 100-year flood is one that we will definitely look at. And that input water goes into the model to estimate the hydraulic changes along the river. So how high does the river rise in this spot or that spot? How fast does it move in the various places? So the hydraulics of the river are influenced, as I said, by the hydrology, how much water you're putting in it in the first place, as well as the cross-sectional geometry that the river has to move through. So you got this water, you put it in the river, you got to force it through some geometry. And depending on what that geometry is, it'll either move fast or slow or rise high or low, depending on that geometry. So the model is essentially a whole bunch of cross sections tied together that water is then forced through from one to the next to predict the various elevations and velocities along the way. And we can use it, so once we have the existing conditions set, we can use it to evaluate alternatives, so changes. Do we remove a dam? Do we change a bridge? All of that kind of stuff can be evaluated in the model. Next slide, please. So we're starting with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association, does these types of models all over the country. Mostly for insurance purposes, right? So everyone that lives in a flood-prone area has flood insurance issued by the federal government through FEMA, and they evaluate the cost of that insurance and the risks through these models that determine where the floodplain is and how high the water will rise. So they have one for the Nemasket River, for the whole of the Taunton River for that matter. And they, fortunately for us, they updated the Nemasket version in 2013, so it's relatively new. So the left picture is a profile, so like a slice, looking with the Assawamsett Ponds is on the upper right, and the junction of the Nemasket and the Taunton River is on the lower left. So you can see the grade of the water surface shown in blue going from right to left in this case, from upstream to downstream, and all the various vertical lines or bridges and dams and other things along the way. And on the right is just a plan view looking from space down on the river with those various cross-sectional transects I talked about drawn across it in all those green lines. So this is the existing FEMA model of the system that we're adapting for our purposes. Next slide. And the way we've done that is we want to make it more detailed for our area of study. So we do that first by cutting it. So we knock off all the stuff below Route 105 in Middleborough that's not part of our study area so that we can focus all the computing power on the area that we are concerned about. And we start adding additional transects. So far we've added 8 additional transects near the Assawamsett Pond Dam that were field surveyed this past year as part of a project that the Herring Commission funded. They had Outback engineers go out and do a bunch of surveying. So we used that data to create 8 transects that we added to the model. We updated the topography with this new topography available statewide. We updated the geometry of the dams based on survey data, and we're continuing to add more transects along the way. So next slide, please. So this is just a shot of the model of the outlet of the Assawamsett Pond Dam through the river and the various transects that were added in that spot and the update to that. So this LIDAR stands for light detection and ranging, which is really fancy pants new science where they fly planes overhead and shoot laser beams down at incredibly high density and record how long it takes for those laser beams to bounce back to the airplane, and can use that, the time differences, to determine the topography beneath it. So this image that you're seeing is the LiDAR topography of the area around the upper Nemasket based on that. So that the state has this available for everyone, for the whole state, and you can download it. It's good for about 2 foot vertical contour interval. And we're using that to join with the field survey in the river itself to do these topographic transects. Next, please. So one of the things that was surveyed was the actual dam itself. So now we've got a much better depiction of how the dam looks in cross-section as compared to what was in the original FEMA model. And interestingly, each of those bays that are present are not actually of equal elevation in terms of what their bottoms are. The fish ladder is the thing on the far right. Next, please. So what's more to come from where we are now? So we're going to do a lot more field survey, particularly the, back please, particularly the Wareham Street Dam, details of that, and the railroad bridge, because those are high priority areas. We'll update the model cross sections with that in other data. We'll evaluate different hydrology, you know, big storms, little storms, drought conditions, et cetera. And then once we have existing conditions mapped, we will evaluate various changes, potential changes. Examples might include changes to the Assawamsett Pond Dam, changes to the Wareham Street Dam, changes to bridges, and channel redesign, floodplain reconnection, dredging, silt trap projects. Next, please. And hand that back to Emily, I believe, to finish us up.
Excellent. Thanks, Neil. Great. So as Neil mentioned, we will be working on the H&H model coming out of this meeting. Well, actually, we'll be first developing the alternatives and then moving into the H&H model. And there are going to be multiple ways. I think Alan was just sending some chats about the possibility of a paddle trip down the Nemasket River, which would be fantastic and definitely would be great for everybody who wants to join that. Also, please keep your eyes out for the second public meeting in June. We would love to keep this whole group together as we move forward. You all, have this kind of introduction from this first meeting. It would be great if we can all return for the second meeting to make sure that we caught everything that we heard today, as well as to discuss some of the possible alternatives. It would be, if you have any questions coming out of today, if you have anything that you've thought of that you didn't get to say, please feel free to email us. We created an email specific to this project, which is apc.nemasket.river@gmail.com. And so this will be a project email that we can use to coordinate various aspects of this project. And it would be great if everybody could email that address and include your contact information. And that way we can send emails about future events. We could send an email about the upcoming meetings, possibly help coordinate the paddle down the Nemasket River. And we promise that we will not send more than one email per month. It's not going to be a constant stream of emails. The goal would be just to say, hey, we're having a meeting on this day in June, please join us, or, join us on these, these various opportunities to engage in the project. And lastly, we have a fantastic project website that Helen made on the SERPED website, and it's called www.serped.org/APC Nemasket. And it has overview of the Nemasket River project, of the Upper Nemasket River Enhancement Plan, of the APC Watershed Management Plan. And also on it is a great survey that includes some of the questions that we discussed today. And so if you felt like, you had anything else to add, feel free to go in there. But it also has a couple of interactive maps where you could indicate places on the river where you think there are specific problems that need to be addressed. It also has a map where you could identify anything that you think is, that you really love about the river or places you love to go recreate. And so please feel free to take some time to visit the website and to do the survey, or to share the survey with anybody else who might not be here tonight, but who might want to participate in this process. So once again, please take note of this email address, apc.nemasket.river@gmail.com, and please send us an email with your contact to get on the list. And then also please feel free to visit the project website. With that, we just want to thank you all for joining us for the first public meeting. Our hope, fingers crossed, maybe future meetings will actually be in person. Not promising anything now, maybe outside at a park. But I love the idea of a canoe trip or other opportunities for us to get to meet in person. If not, we'll be back here and look forward to continuing to work with everyone here, as well as hopefully more people from the community as we continue these conversations about the future of the river. So with that, I know we're right at our kind of time, 8:30. And so if anybody wants to jump off, feel free to do so. If anybody has any other questions or any other comments that they wanted to share, feel free. I will stop sharing my screen and we can open it up to any questions or comments from anybody in the group.
Hi, Emily.
Yes.
This is Alan Crowley. I just want to make an offer to anybody who's here, if they want to take a trip on the Nemasket anytime, to give me a holler. I put my phone number on the chat. My emails, I'm on Facebook, pretty easily to find. It's Alan, A-L-L-I-N. Kind of narrows things down a little bit, But if anybody's going on the river if anybody on the technical team or anything wants to see the river or see a certain spot, you can give me a holler. I have life jackets, I have paddles. I was a whitewater rafting guide for about 10 years. I have swiftwater rescue training, CPR, all that stuff. So I'm pretty good on the river. And I'm more than happy to help in any way I can.
That's excellent, Alan. Thank you so much for that offer. I think it's a wonderful place for our next gathering on the river. I love that plan. Excellent. Well, I will definitely send you an email, Alan, and then hopefully everybody can email the apc.nemasket.river email, and then I'm more than happy, Alan, to help coordinate or send an email out if we finalize a date for that.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Excellent. Any other final questions, comments? No? Excellent. Well, it was really wonderful to get to meet you all tonight. Hopefully everybody will get out. I think it's supposed to be really beautiful on Sunday and this weekend. So maybe we'll all bump into each other at Oliver Mills or Wareham Street, watching the herring run. I'm sure it's going to be a beautiful weekend out there.
I do have one question.
Yes, Janice.
So this whole process now is just information gathering and planning, and you're not actually going to be doing something until after September.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is we're in the planning process right now, Dennis. And so there's what we developed through this conversation here, the Upper Nemasket River Enhancement Plan. It'll culminate in the fall. And at that point, it is going to go through a whole other set of process in order to get funded and to be able to move forward with on-the-ground activities. And so at this point, we are in the process of doing these studies, doing the H&H study that will help us to be able to evaluate the alternatives and then to hopefully come out of the process with an alternative that we can then share, with everyone in terms of kind of being able to understand how that alternative will actually meet the objectives of the project. But we will not be, in this planning process, we will not be doing anything on the ground in terms of changes to the river.
Sounds like potentially not for years.
That is the planning process. It's the long-term vision, right? Of kind of setting up and clarifying, the longer-term vision, and then understanding where and how that might kind of begin to get implemented, and so part of the planning process will probably include some sort of phasing to understand how these various things might work together, but it's not going to be happening in the next year or two.
I have one more question, Emily.
Yep.
The next meeting in June, is that in the evening like this, or is it during work schedule?
I think we thought that evenings would work best. So since people are usually at work during the daytimes, is this a time that generally works for people? I know it's pretty late, but it seems, in terms of getting home and getting settled in, that it seemed to kind of work. But is there did you ask that, Bill, out of concern, or is there thoughts about what would be a better time?
I wouldn't be able to make it during the day,
Okay.
Monday through Friday, but
Yeah.
evenings is good for me. But it's tough for everybody. Everyone's busy doing something.
I know, absolutely. Yeah. So most likely we'll either do an evening during the weekday, or if we decide to try to do something in the daytime, it would probably be like a Saturday, like if we tried to meet up out in a park or something, but we'll just see what the world's like in June. Right?
Yeah.
We got to take it one step at a time. And so, but for right now, we'll probably plan to be online on Zoom. And then, if something changes, we can adapt.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. This was great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for joining tonight. It was really great to see familiar faces and new faces. Okay, excellent. With that, I'm going to sign off, and hopefully we will all meet up on the river in the coming months while the water levels are hopefully enough to float our boats. And then we will continue this process moving into the summer. Great. Okay, everybody, we'll have a great weekend. Have a good evening, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.